He had said it casually, with a half-smile that felt more like a warning than a joke. If my friend's jokes bothered you, you could leave. Just pay your share. The table had gone quiet for a second, then laughter burst out, sharp and careless. I felt every pair of eyes on me, waiting to see if I would shrink, apologize, or laugh along. Instead, I smiled. Not the polite smile I'd practiced over years of uncomfortable dinners, but a calm one. I said, "All right," pushed my chair back, and stood up. I remember the sound of the chair legs scraping against the floor. It was louder than I expected, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I'd finally finished. I picked up my bag slowly, not rushing, not dramatic. He watched me, eyebrows raised, amused. His friends were still grinning, nudging each other, as if this were all part of the entertainment. I walked to the counter, my heart beating hard but steady, and asked for my bill. When it came, I paid only for my meal. I didn't hesitate. I didn't explain. I thanked the cashier and walked out into the cool night air. Behind me, through the glass, I could see the moment the laughter died. It was subtle at first, smiles faltering, confusion setting in. Someone leaned forward to look at the receipt. Another frowned. He gestured toward the door, then down at the table, realization spreading across his face. I didn't wait to see more. I stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing in deeply as if I'd been underwater for too long and had finally surfaced. As I walked, memories replayed themselves uninvited. The first time I'd met his friends, how they'd joked about my job, calling it cute. The way he'd laughed instead of correcting them. The dinners where I'd smiled through comments about women being too sensitive, about how relationships worked better when one person didn't take things so seriously. Each time I'd told myself it wasn't worth making a scene. Each time I'd swallowed the discomfort and told myself I was overreacting. Tonight, something had shifted. Maybe it was the way he'd said you can leave, like a challenge. Maybe it was the exhaustion of always being the one to adjust. My phone buzzed before I reached the end of the block. His name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. It buzzed again. Then a message. "Where did you go? Are you serious right now?" I slipped the phone back into my bag and kept walking. With every step, the tightness in my chest loosened a little more. I wasn't angry. I felt strangely light, like I'd put down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. At home, I kicked off my shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the silence settle. The phone buzzed again, then again. This time, it was a longer message, something about embarrassing him, about how his friends were just joking, about how I'd overreacted. I stared at the words, noticing how familiar they felt. The pattern was clear when I wasn't sitting across from him, when his voice couldn't soften the edges of what he was saying. I typed a reply, erased it, typed another, then set the phone face down without sending anything. I wasn't ready to explain myself again. I wasn't ready to argue about whether my feelings were valid. Instead, I made tea and stood by the window, watching cars pass, thinking about how small moments could become turning points if you let them. The next morning, sunlight filled the room, and with it came a sense of clarity I hadn't expected. I checked my phone, missed calls, more messages. His tone had shifted overnight, from irritated to apologetic to defensive again. He said he hadn't meant it like that. He said his friends liked me, really. He said we should talk. I believed that he believed what he was saying, but belief wasn't enough anymore. I went to work, answered emails, attended meetings, and noticed something surprising. I felt focused, grounded, as if setting that boundary the night before had aligned something inside me. During lunch, a coworker asked how my weekend had been, and I almost laughed at how much had happened in such a short time. I just said it had been eye-opening. That evening, he showed up at my door. I hadn't invited him, but I wasn't shocked. He stood there with that familiar look, earnest, a little wounded, confident that we could smooth things over if we just talked long enough. I let him in, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to hear myself speak the truth out loud. He started with an apology, then slipped into explanations. I listened without interrupting, noticing how he framed everything as a misunderstanding, a joke gone wrong, an overreaction. When he finished, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for reassurance. Instead, I told him how it had felt sitting at that table, how the jokes hadn't been new, how his comment about paying my share hadn't been playful, it had been dismissive. I told him that walking out wasn't about the bill, it was about respect. For the first time, he didn't interrupt me. He looked unsettled, as if seeing me from a new angle he hadn't anticipated. I didn't know what would happen next, only that whatever came after would be different. Something had changed between us the moment I stood up from that table, and there was no going back to who I'd been before.